Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. As I look at some of the comments and some of the requests that we get from you after a number of the podcasts that we've done, a lot of you are suggesting that we spend a little more time talking about tariffs, maybe even in an educational standpoint. Well, I don't know if I'm qualified to do that, although I'm not an economist, although sadly, an awful lot of the people in government that are making these decisions are not economists either, or they seem to be, practicing voodoo economics to try to put some of these policies in place. So let's try to address some of the concerns and issues that we as consumers and taxpayers, frankly, have raised over the last little while. Because let's face it, it can be confusing sometimes. And as always, invariably, governments on both sides of the border or whatever countries we're dealing with here will try to put their own spin on that. And if you're just blindly following the government because they're your type, they're your team, you just follow what they're saying and say, well, that's got to be true because I like those guys. And would they lie to me? The short answer is, yeah, they would. But let's try to address that. And right off the bat, I want to talk about a couple of comments I got from some readers and viewers over the last little while about the tariff situation here in Canada. We're dealing essentially, of course, with the United States and the tariffs that Trump has imposed on us. And Canada has imposed their own set of tariffs on a number of strategic areas in the U.S. economy. We'll talk a little bit about those in just a couple of minutes. But a couple of people seem to be under the impression that this is going to be a cash cow for governments. Well, it is true that when tariffs are in place, there is money that accrues to the government. And somebody's suggesting here that they had read someplace that all the money that the Canadian government is going to accrue from any tariffs that are imposed here are going to be going to the CBC because Mark Carney said he was going to dedicate that. Well, wherever you read that, it's wrong, okay, first and foremost. Mr. Carney, Prime Minister Carney, has said that he wants to increase funding for the CBC, but he hasn't done that yet. Okay, that was a campaign promise. There has to be a budget, which has to be passed through the House before anything can come along. You can't arbitrarily do that just because the guy south of the border is arbitrarily making decisions. So that's one thing. The other element to this, too, is that the tariffs are coming to the government, and that can accrue as a financial incentive. But the Prime Minister has already said that any money that comes into Canada because of the tariffs that Canadians have imposed on other jurisdictions will go towards those who've been adversely affected by the tariffs. In other words, workers, small businesses, things of that nature. That's a commitment that this government has made. Anything of that, you're going to direct it all to the CBC because they're friendly to us. First of all, it's not happening, and B, to suggest that the CBC and the mainstream media is government friendly is a misnomer too, and again, something that was pumped up from some of the other websites and things that you'll see. So let's try to maintain some clarity here. So back to the initial idea, and I guess one of the things that has stoked this, well, first of all, because we're being impacted by tariffs on a daily basis, but there was news over the last couple of days that the U.S. government has signed a major deal with the United Kingdom, the U.K., reduction in tariffs, and it's a deal that was long coming, and it did. It had been years that they've been negotiating this. And the Trump administration is now lauding the fact and patting themselves on the back, saying that this deal with the UK is going to mean about $6 billion in tariff revenues are going to flow to the government. I don't know where they got that number from, but let's bear it down just a little bit and parse some of this. First of all, as we found out, forget about the rhetoric from the White House and the Trump administration. There was no deal signed between the United States and the UK, a trade deal. There was the promise to have a deal, to move forward on this. They haven't negotiated at all. There's nothing in way of hard facts that this is going to happen and this is going to happen. All they've said is, yes, we need to do this. They have an agreement to make a deal. So we don't know the nuts and bolts of this yet, to be determined. I don't know where they pulled the $6 billion figure out, but here's the thing. Even if that were to be the case, let's take them at their word, which I find difficult to do, but we'll do that for the sake of the discussion here. $6 billion is not being paid by the UK government. And I know the Trump administration will come back at this time and time again that they'll pay. No, consumers pay for this, okay? If you're a UK company or a Canadian company, since we're being impacted by this at the same time. And I know a number of companies that are being impacted by tariffs. So there's a steel company in my hometown in the Hamilton area that has been very, very successful. It's not ArcelorMittal or Stelco. It's one of the smaller companies, but a very efficient company that has been doing major business in the United States for years and years. They make structural steel and things of that nature. And they've been involved in huge projects in the Northeast United States, and now they're expanding into other areas too, and have been for years. Very profitable situation. They benefit, the communities where these things are being built benefits, everybody wins, until these tariffs came along. But if they continue to make steel, and you want to build an office tower or a factory, whatever the case might be, and you're, Joe's factory building, just to simplify things, you want that steel, you will pay the tariff. The company that produced it in this country does not pay the tariff. They don't give that money to the U.S. government and say, please just let that go in there and hopefully somebody will buy it. The person who is buying it will pay for the tariff. Yes, that money flows to the government, but it's not coming from the Canadian government. It's coming from the U.S. company that wants that product. Whether it's lumber, whether it's steel, whether it's aluminum, whatever the case might be, those things will still be flowing. Sadly, not in the same amount of numbers that we had before the tariffs were imposed, but it's still happening. But the companies, the U.S. companies that want those products are the ones that pay the tariff. So basically, the U.S. government is basically taxing American people. It's the American company that's going to pay the tariff, not the other government. And eventually, you know as well as I do that if a company has increased costs because of lumber, because of steel, whatever the case might be, they pass the cost on to the consumer. So if they don't have enough Canadian lumber, for instance, to build homes, which is one of the things that governments down there have been saying we all need to do, we're doing the same thing here, well, they're going to charge more. If it's going to cost them more to bring that lumber in, they're going to charge more. So it's going to cost more to buy a house in the United States because it's going to cost more to build a house in the United States. Same thing with aluminum, with steel, with just about everything else. So it's a misnomer to suggest that the consumers won't be impacted. And time again, I'm sure you've seen, if you watch some of the political shows from the U.S., time and time again, members of the Trump administration will simply deny that consumers are going to be negatively impacted. Of course they're going to be negatively impacted by this. If the cost of beef goes up, and Sobeys or whomever you buy your stuff from, they're not going to absorb that price. If it goes up from $10 to $15, you and I will pay that difference. That's what happens with consumers. And the government is just basically, well, they're not being truthful to suggest that it's not going to have an impact. It is absolutely going to have an impact on what's happening. And conversely, of course, what's going on with the China situation. Just as we do this podcast today, word comes that the American and Chinese governments have agreed to lower their tariffs, not eliminate them yet, but to lower the ridiculous tariffs. I mean, they were talking, 145% tariffs and 120%. It was a stupid game that they were playing. But the problem here, and this goes back to what we've talked about many times on the podcast here, is, well, when the government's going to smarten up and stop doing these ridiculous tariff things? When we as consumers start complaining to our government. And that's what happened, especially with the U.S. and Chinese situation. And we've all seen these huge freighters, with these huge containers, and they've got hundreds, if not thousands, of these things on a daily basis going into U.S. ports from China, bringing goods in from, that are going to be consumed rapidly by U.S. consumers. Well, late last week, essentially, that dried up. We knew it was coming, and that we saw the first signs of that, where there were no large container ships coming in to U.S. ports anymore. In other words, the goods were stopped because of the tariff situation. So that the people that run those corporations, the ones who do have access to Trump and his people in the White House, simply said, this has got to stop. And it did, probably within hours of them saying, look, we're losing money here, buddy. Stop this. Well, all of a sudden, the Chinese government and the U.S. government are going to try to negotiate down to what's going on. It's all about pressure. And that's what we're counting on here. So to the question of, well, when is Canada going to get that same sort of treatment from the United States? I don't have a definite answer. I can't say it's going to be a week from Tuesday or it's going to be June 15th. I don't know. But it's going to be as the result of pressure from U.S. businesses that are saying, look, at these Canadian tariffs are impacting us. It's costing us more, or we're losing business. We've already seen situations like that already, where especially U.S. businesses in border towns and other places are already complaining about the lack of Canadians going down there. They counted on that revenue from Canadians going down to Florida, to Arizona, whatever the case might be, but even to border states to do their shopping or to spend some time on holidays. That has been reduced drastically, and now all of a sudden those people are losing money. That's the sort of pressure that has to be applied to governments to simply say, you got to rethink this, okay? Because it's costing us business. And the government has to basically come to the conclusion that we've got to reduce the tariffs because we can't afford for these businesses to go out of business. And I don't know that we're there yet in a lot of these situations to deal with Canada-U.S. relations. I'd like to think that there's going to be some common sense that's going to be applied here, but you just don't know. And you can't count on that, obviously, from the Trump administration, especially because I don't know if Trump believes the kind of rhetoric that he's spewing these days or not. But the fact is that the MAGA people, and let's face it, there are millions upon millions of them down there, will believe anything this guy says. If he says consumers aren't going to be impacted, they'll believe it simply because it was Trump that said it. Even though they can see the price of gas, the price of groceries, the price of houses are starting to increase, they don't seem to understand, or they don't seem to connect the dots to say maybe it's because of some of these economic policies. When they finally smarten up, or enough people smarten up to understand that there's a cause and effect at play here, then maybe that pressure is going to get the government to change. It did before. As we've talked about, this is not the first time Trump has tried to do this, especially with the Canadian economy, and he backed off the last time. He backed off on the tariffs on steel and aluminum and lumber and other Canadian goods last time because he got pressure from governors, from states, from local governments about the impact that it was having. Problem we have here is, especially with this incarnation of the Trump administration, he's surrounded himself with filthy rich people. That's who he likes to hang out with, right? You know, just about everybody in his cabinet are millionaires, if not billionaires, and they're the last ones that are impacted by these sorts of things. So he's not hearing from anybody of any consequence. I'm sorry to burst the bubble here, but it's pretty obvious that Donald Trump doesn't give a damn about the average American. He doesn't care about the American farmer. He's already cut subsidies and the sorts of things that have been lifelines for American farmers for years. That's gone now. A lot of that stuff is gone. And now a lot of them are saying, wait, we voted for this guy, and this is what he did to us? Well, the same is going to happen with people that are shopping at Walmart or Target or wherever the department stores are down there. When the price of those goods goes up, they're going to start complaining. And eventually, you hope that that's going to have an impact on this government. But it's going to take a little longer simply because he's surrounded himself with people that are filthy rich that aren't going to have a direct impact by this. And at the same token, those that are within that inner circle basically don't seem to have the backbone to speak up and say this is wrong. They just don't want to lose the standing they have with Donald Trump. So I don't want to say, hey, just be patient, because that's really not the sort of thing that we want to hear here. You want some direct solutions to this. And I do too. I mean, I'm a consumer just like you, and we're all being negatively impacted by this. But it's a battle, and it's a war, and it's going to take some time to try to find some common ground that both sides are going to agree to. And I'm hoping that's going to happen sooner than later. You know, I know are still, the United States' #1 trading partner, but we have to wait until the sting of the tariffs that we've imposed start to have that effect on U.S. economies, not necessarily the global U.S. economy, but individual economies in places like Tennessee or Texas or New York State or places like that are going to simply say, look, we're red states. We put you in, Mr. President. You are now having policies in place that are having a negative impact on us. You got to do something about it. And sadly, we're not there yet. Hopefully, that's going to happen sooner than later. Certainly follow that story. That's it for this edition of the podcast. I know it's a complicated issue, but we'll try to muddle through this as we get updates from both sides of the government, both the United States and Canadian governments over the next little while. And of course, with the swearing in of the Carney cabinet this week, of course, in Canada, I will get a clearer picture. The finance minister, the international trade ministers, and things of that nature will be able to understand just who's in charge of this file and how they're moving to try to make things easier for all of us. And we'll certainly talk about that at the time. As always, you can catch our podcast on Substack, on Spotify, Apple, certainly on YouTube and Blue Sky, and so many other different platforms as well. Always look forward to getting your feedback about what we're talking about. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work in producing the podcast. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wissenz Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wissenz Law, 905-522-1102 or wissenslaw.com.